by F.C.H. Wendell. Chapter 1, Part 2. B. Asiatic Sources. First among these we must mention the Bible. The sacred writings are, as may be expected from their character, not the most copious or important sources of Egyptian history. The first two books, Genesis and Exodus, frequently mention Egypt, but they are concerned only with the fate of the Hebrews who dwelt in Egypt, and do not go into Egyptian history. In the books of the Kings and in Chronicles, frequent allusions are made to Egyptian history, and what we find here is always confirmed by the monuments. The prophets, especially Ezekiel and Jeremiah, frequently allude to contemporaneous Egyptian history. Of greater importance are the Assyrian inscriptions. These inscriptions shed light on a period of Egyptian history of which we know nothing from the national monuments. I refer to the period of the Assyrian invasions in the 7th century BC. The Assyrian kings, whose inscriptions are of importance in this connection, are Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, Sanherib, and Assurbanipal. Next in importance are the inscriptions of King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon, who invaded Egypt in the 6th century BC. C. Classical sources. Of the host of classical writers who wrote on Egypt, I give in the following only the principal ones. The book that long stood unchallenged as a source of Egyptian history is the Historia of Herodotus of Halicarnassus. The study of the monuments has, however, revealed great errors in this work, and has proved it to be utterly untrustworthy as a history. Herodotus's great fault was that he believed all the stories his guides told him, some of which are so improbable that we are surprised to find that so intelligent a man as our author was should have believed them at all. He visited Egypt about 450 BC, at a time when it was under Persian rule, and probably never got farther south than Memphis. What he saw he described accurately, and that part of his history which relates to the times of the last Psametics and the Persian rulers of the land is perfectly reliable. His book is the book of a tourist, and all his faults are the faults of a tourist who travels in a strange and wonderful land without any knowledge of the language, and having but a short time to do the sights. Another reason why the book is in great part unreliable is because the Greeks, believing the Egyptians possessed of a deep and mysterious learning, and having some dim tradition of the fact that their arts and sciences were originally derived from Egypt, though they had already far surpassed their teachers, sought to derive their entire civilization, their religion and philosophy, which were purely native, as well as art and science, which had indeed received their first impulse from Egypt, from the mystic lore of that most ancient land. The Egyptian priests, with whom the Greek tourists came into contact, naturally strengthened them in this belief, and gave themselves a very mysterious air, thus still more increasing their reputations for learning. One word on the subject of castes may well be said here before we leave Herodotus. From his work, an erroneous impression has crept into many modern books on Egypt that the ancient Egyptians were divided into so-called castes. In ancient Egypt, there existed, of course, the same classes that existed in all ancient monarchies. There was the king and the royal family, the hereditary nobility, the middle class, consisting of merchants, farmers, mechanics, from which government officials and priests were recruited, as well as from the princes and nobles, the laborers, and the slaves. No one was, however, compelled to follow in the footsteps of his father. Thus, if the father was a government official, a priest, an officer, a merchant, a farmer, or a mechanic, the son need not necessarily also be a government official, a priest, an officer, a merchant, a farmer, or a mechanic, but was free to choose his vocation. We have even instances of men of humble birth rising to the highest position in the gift of the crown, and that does not look as though the Egyptians had possessed a system of castes. The most important of these writers is Manetho of Sebennythos. He lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and his book was written about 271 BC, as tradition asserts at the instance of Ptolemy Philadelphus. Manetho was a high priest and temple scribe of Sebennythos, and was thus familiar with the Egyptian language. He was also an able classical scholar. Thus, he was fitted for the work of writing an Egyptian history as perhaps no other man then living, his learning giving him access alike to the native monuments and the classic authors, the errors of which latter he attacked. The chief value of the work lay in the fact that, being based on the native sources, it must have been quite reliable. Manetho divided all the kings from Mena to Alexander the Great into 31 so-called dynasties, stating from what part of Egypt the various dynasties came. On what his division is based, we cannot say. It is important to note that the Turin Papyrus makes a somewhat different division from his. He also divided Egyptian history into 3 periods. 1. Old Empire, dynasties 1 to 11. 2. Middle Empire, dynasties 12 to 19. 3. New Empire, dynasties 20 to 30. We retain his terms, but make a somewhat different division, as will be seen in the course of this book. Unfortunately, this important work is lost, and only fragmentary extracts of it have been preserved. The historians who made these extracts were not guided by a true scientific spirit, but took only what happened to suit their immediate purpose, and the extracts frequently conflict with one another in important details. These copyists were Josephus, the Jewish historian, Africanus, and Eusebius. Of course, we can form no just estimate of a work preserved in so fragmentary a condition. Diodorus Siculus, who visited Egypt about 57 BC, wrote an account of the country. His work is, however, but little more trustworthy than that of Herodotus. Diodorus seems to have had all of Herodotus's faults, but none of his virtues. Manetho he does not seem to have known. At all events, he does not refer to his book. Strabo and Pliny both touch Egyptian history incidentally, but are not trustworthy. Plutarch, who lived in the 2nd century A.D., wrote a fair work on Egyptian religion under the title of Peri-Isidos kai Osiridos. Horapollon Niloeus wrote between the years 379 and 395 A.D. a work under the title Hieroglyphica, in which he gives mostly correct explanations of such hieroglyphics as frequently occur in Ptolemaic inscriptions. He knew, however, merely the ideographic and not the phonetic value of these hieroglyphs. Section 3. Prehistoric Conditions. When we first come upon Egypt, it is a full-grown state possessed of a well-ordered government, a well-organized society, and a civilization of a high order. At the dawn of history, the formative period of the nation was over, and Egypt was a finished product. How many centuries the formative period lasted, we cannot say, but we can, from facts observed in the later development of the land and its religion, make some deductions as to the prehistoric conditions of the country. We can even, and that is of great importance, trace in general outline the formative process, the result of which was the Egyptian state. Egypt was not always a single united country, as it was in historic times, but was, for a long time previous to Mena, divided into 2 countries, which were entirely independent of one another, and remained so until King Mena united them and founded the Egyptian state about 3200 B.C. These 2 countries were known, even after the Union, as the North and the South, and the official name of the United Kingdom was Taui, both lands, thus preserving the memory that there were originally 2 countries where in historical times there was but one. One of the king's titles was Sam Taui, uniter of both lands. We can even say what cities were the capitals of the 2 states. The capital of the south was in all probability the city of Nekhebet. That of the north was the city of Buto. We deduce these facts from the fact that the goddess of Nekhebet, whose name was also Nekhebet, was regarded in all epochs of Egyptian history as the tutelar divinity of Upper Egypt, the south, and the goddess of Buto, known originally as the double city of Pe and Dep, and in later times as Per-Uatch, was regarded in all epochs of Egyptian history as the tutelar deity of Lower Egypt, the north. Each of these 2 countries had its own crown. Lower Egypt a curiously shaped red crown, and Upper Egypt a peculiar white crown, shaped like one of the pieces used in playing ninepins. When the 2 countries were united, these 2 crowns were combined into one as the Peshent, or double crown, the white crown being put inside of the red. These 2 countries were in themselves composite products, resulting from the union of various small districts, which we designate as nomes. That these nomes were originally independent of one another we can deduce with some degree of certainty from the fact that they retained their autonomy through all epochs of Egyptian history, had their own hereditary rulers known as nomarchoi, their own local governments, and what is most important in this inquiry, their own peculiar religious beliefs. Egyptian tradition naturally ignores this state of things, asserting that the first pharaohs of the land were the gods, that on these succeeded the Shemsu Hor, followers of Horus, a sort of demigods, and on these, finally, King Mena, that in Mena's time the two countries were united into one was a fact that could not be spirited away by any amount of tradition. So a legend arose to explain the fact that the country was divided before Mena's time, that Horus and Set had divided the country between them. Such a legend, which seeks to explain existing conditions, we call aetiological. The question whether or not the Egyptians were aborigines has been frequently discussed. The most probable solution of the problem is this: the Egyptians, as a race, were aborigines, and they always looked upon themselves as such. They designate only their own people as Rametu, men. The other peoples may be Syrians, Negroes, or Asiatics, but men they are not. It seems probable, however, that these aborigines were subdued by a small band of invaders who came from southwestern Asia, and who, though not strong enough to influence the race, yet were sufficiently powerful to force on the conquered people their language and perhaps some of their religious conceptions. The relations between conqueror and conquered were then pretty much the same as those between the Anglo-Saxons and aboriginal Britons, and those between the conquering Arabs and the modern Egyptians. Of course, this is merely a hypothesis, though it is a very probable one. To speak of a Stone Age in prehistoric Egypt is entirely out of the way. Stone implements were used for many centuries, even in historic times, and the Stone Age, if we may speak of one at all, falls within the historic periods. Section 4. A brief sketch of the ancient Egyptian religion. To understand the development of Egyptian religion, we must understand the prehistoric conditions sketched above, and must have a thorough knowledge of Egyptian history. We would, therefore, advise our readers to read the history before they read this sketch of the religion of Egypt. The Egyptians were originally what is called animists, that is to say, they believed that just as man is endowed with a soul, so every animal, every plant, every inanimate object is also endowed with a soul, or rather, is possessed of a spirit or demon, which is the cause of the good or evil qualities the animal, plant, or thing in question possesses. The animal, plant, or thing in question thus became the object of a primitive cult with a view to propitiating the same. The two great motives of primitive cults are always love and fear, and of the two, fear is the stronger. The savage is quicker at propitiating an evil spirit in order to preserve himself from harm than at showing gratitude to a benignant one. The early Egyptians worshipped animals and trees with especial fervor. Of the tree cult, we do not know more than that every nome had its sacred trees, that the sycamore was sacred to the goddess Hathor, and that one of the gods bore the name Cheri Bakef, he in his oil tree, that is, the spirit dwelling in the oil tree. Of the animal worship we know a little more. Both motives of primitive cults, love and fear, must have operated on the Egyptian mind in this cult. The evil spirits that dwell in the lion, the crocodile, the hippopotamus must be propitiated, and to this end the animal must be worshipped. The primitive mind cannot abstract the spirit from the animal it has chosen for a dwelling place. Again, it can scarce have been fear that impelled the worship of the bull, the cow, and such useful scavengers as the ebi, the vulture, and the sparrow-hawk. Even in later times, when animism no longer prevailed, some traces of this early animal cult still remained, in that various animals were looked upon as sacred to the gods. How the sacred animals came to be connected with their divinities we do not undertake to say. We shall here confine ourselves to an enumeration of the various sacred animals. The oldest and chief of these were the Apis, bull sacred to Ptah, and the Nevis, bull sacred to Reharmachis. The cow was sacred to Isis, Hathor, and Nephthys, the ram to Ammon and Chnum, the cat to Ra, Socket, Bast, and Tefnut, the lion to Pokhet and Soket. The ebi and Cynocephalus were sacred to Thot. The jackal was sacred to Anubis, the sparrowhawk to Horus, the vulture to Nekhebet, the asp to Watch, and the crocodile to Sebek. Frequently, the deities were depicted with the heads of their sacred animals. Thus, Horus always has the head of a sparrowhawk, Chnum that of a ram, Thot that of an ebi. Nephthys and Hathor are cow-headed, a solar disk being fixed between the horns. Other examples could be given, but these will suffice. From this early animism was developed in the course of time a polydaemonism, that is, a belief in many demons or spirits. This is the second stage in religious development. The spirit has been abstracted from the animal, plant, or thing it inhabited and possessed, and has been given a separate, independent existence. From this polydaemonism was later on developed polytheism, or the belief in many gods. How these changes came about we cannot say, for when we first come upon the Egyptian religion, it has gone through all of these stages, but it has retained numerous traces of this early development. This development must have taken place in the various nomes before their union and independently in each, for they present to us very varied religious beliefs. Each nome had its own peculiar local divinities and its own local theosophy. The head of the local pantheon had his temple in the local capital. These local divinities were all supreme in their own localities, and it is them that the people worshipped, whatever divinity might be the head of the national pantheon. Every house had attached to it a chapel in which the local divinities were worshipped. These local deities were all, as a matter of policy, recognized by the national government as the guardian deities of their respective localities. The national religion was, in return, recognized by the various local governments, and the head of the national pantheon had dedicated to him a chapel in each of the local temples. The various religions of these nomes, all in themselves polytheistic, united after the union to form that composite whole, the Egyptian religion, which we may well designate as an agglomerated polytheism. Thus we see that, just as from the union of the nomes, and finally of Upper and Lower Egypt, resulted the Egyptian state, so from a union of the local religions of these nomes resulted the Egyptian religion. It has been already mentioned above that Nekhebet was regarded as the guardian divinity of the south, and Wacha as that of the north. In many localities, the head of the local pantheon had associated with him two other divinities who shared his eminence and formed with him what we call a triad. Such a triad consisted generally of father, mother, and son. Thus, the triad of Memphis embraced Ptah, his wife Soket, and their son Imhotep. That of Abydos, Osiris, his wife Isis, and their son Horus. And that of Thebes, Ammon, his wife Mut, and their son Chonsu. But we also find triads consisting of one male and two female members, possibly father, mother, and daughter. For example, that of Elephantine, Chnum, Satet, and Anuket. Another combination of gods is the Ennead, or circle of 9 gods. The Ennead first appears in the 4th dynasty, about 3000 BC. It consists of 9 members, combined in an apparently arbitrary manner. 1. Shu, 2. Tefnut, 3. Keb, 4. Nut, 5. Osiris, 6. Isis, 7. Horus, 8. Set, 9. Nephthys. Where Shu and Tefnut are brother and sister, Keb and Nut, man and wife, parents of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Osiris, Isis, and Horus are father, mother, and son, and Set and Nephthys, man and wife. The Ennead was originated by the priests of On-Heliopolis in order to bring into closer connection the various local religions. These priests claim that it was originated by Tum, a solar deity who was in Heliopolis considered the leader of the Ennead, though standing outside of it. In fact, the Ennead, which had national acceptance, was everywhere assigned a different deity, the head of the local pantheon as leader, though its membership remained fixed, except that in later times Set was eliminated and Horwer, a form of the god Horus, or Thought, put in his place. To many of the Egyptian gods there has been ascribed a cosmological origin. Thus, Ta of Memphis and Chnum of Elephantine were in the very first line considered as world builders, or to use the scientific term, as demiurgoi, while the priests of On Heliopolis ascribed the same function to Ra and Tum. But we must not wonder at this multitude of world builders. It is but consistent with the entire character of the Egyptian religion. It is but natural that the important office of world builder should be ascribed in every locality to the head of the local pantheon. These were not, however, the cosmological gods proper. There was a number of other gods of undoubted cosmological origin that had not the slightest connection with any pantheon, some of which were worshipped by the people generally, while others were mere speculative deities, the full import of which was known to the priesthood alone. One of the chief divinities of the former class was Ranutet, the goddess of the harvest, who was recognized and worshipped throughout the land. She had her chapels in the granaries and her altars in the open field, and was ardently worshipped by the great landowners as well as by the small farmers. Of her official cult we know nothing. Another popular cosmological figure was Hapi, the god of the Nile, of whose cult in the times of the New Empire, B.C. 1530 through 1050, we are well informed. Hundreds of hymns addressed to him have come down to us, all expressing a fervent devotion and sincere gratitude for his many good offices. Thousands of statuettes representing the god have also been preserved. With time, he assumed a national importance rivaled only by the heads of the great national religions, Ta, Ra, Osiris, and Amun. This is but natural, for it is to this stream that Egypt owes all its prosperity, aye, its very existence. Min, the agricultural god of Qebti, Koptos, fifth Upper Egyptian nome, also belongs to this class of divinities. A typical representative of the second class is Chepra, the god of the mysterious becoming. He was a purely theosophical figure and had no hold on the popular mind. Results of cosmological speculation are likewise the 8 gods of the elements, so called the Ogdoas of Chmunu Hermopolis, the home of thought. They appear in 4 couples: 1. Nun and Nut; 2. He and Hehet; 3. Kek and Keket; and 4. Nenu and Nenut. Originally, there were only the 4 male divinities, as they appear in the paintings on the walls of the tomb of Seti I, died about 1300 B.C. The goddesses are later additions, their names being merely the feminine forms of those of the male divinities. The meaning ascribed to them is this: 1. Nun is the male generative principle of the universe, the father of Ra. Nut is the female conceptive principle, while together they personify the original chaos. 2. He and Hehet personify eternity. 3. Kek and Keket, darkness. And 4. Nenu and Nenut, moisture. The full development of this curious cosmological doctrine seems to belong to a later theosophy. Another cosmological couple are Shu and his sister Tefnut. Shu is the god that supports the heavens, and is in all probability a personification of the atmosphere. His sister Tefnut owes her existence merely to the desire of giving every god a female companion. Keb and Nut, his wife, are also a cosmological couple. He is a personification of the earth, she of the heavens. They are given a place in one of the acknowledged national religions as parents of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. Egyptian name Nebhat. There were several deities that owed their existence to pure speculation, and had, as a rule, no connection with the pantheons. The most important of these was Mat, the goddess of truth and justice, who is the personification of these qualities. She had national importance as Lady Patroness of Justice, and its ministers, the judges, who were all priests of Mat. There is little reason to doubt the statement of Herodotus that the judges wore her picture on their breasts. Of her cult, however, we know nothing. Safchet, the goddess of wisdom, of which she is a personification, was regarded as the wife of Thought, and was no doubt a very old figure in the theosophy of Chmunu Hermopolis. Thought himself is a result of speculation, the personification of learning and wisdom, the scribe of the gods, and as such the patron of scribes. He has in this capacity national recognition. His home, Chmunu, seems to have been a great seat of speculative theosophy. Besides these many divinities, and our space has not permitted us to name more than the most important ones, untold legions of demons, some attached to a particular pantheon, others floating about in wild and unrestrained freedom, help to complicate the religion. Osiris alone had 42 demons attached to his person as associate judges in the court that sat in the lower world, in that part of it known as the Hall of the Two Truths, and tried the departed souls to judge of their worthiness to enter the blessed abodes. Each of these had a peculiarly absurd name, which the dead man had to know, and to each one he had to make a special negative confession. Besides these 42 judges, unnumbered good and evil spirits peopled the lower world, all of which the dead man had to know and name at sight. It is only of these spirits of the Amenti, as the Egyptians called the lower world, that we know the names and to some extent the natures. It was, by the by, far more important to know the former than the latter, for by merely calling him by name, the dead man could bring to his aid a good spirit or exorcise an evil one. To know the demon was to have power over him, so that the outlook of the poor soul was not so bad after all. The rite of circumcision, so extensively practiced by the ancient Egyptians, has been brought into connection with this belief in demons. It is conjectured that this rite was originally a substitute for human sacrifice, which may have been practiced in prehistoric times. Now we inquire in what relation the various local religions stood to one another. Part of them remained in obscurity, having only local significance. Part came with time to have national import, and it is now our object to inquire into the cause of this. 8 of these religions came with time to have national sway: those of Ptah of Memphis, of Ra of Heliopolis, Osiris of Abydos, Ammon of Thebes, Sebek of Crocodololopolis, Neit of Sais, Hathor of Dendera, and Horus of Edfu. The causes of this lay partly in the character of the religion itself, partly in the history of the nation. 3 religions seem to have come into prominence much at the same time: those of Ra, Osiris, and Ptah. Ra owes his early prominence to the fact that he was the solar deity par excellence. He was looked upon as the first divine king of Egypt. His religion is of peculiar interest to us, for it finally culminated in a solar monotheism under Amenhotep IV, about 1382 through 1370 BC, who set up Aten, the solar disk, as the supreme and, to a certain extent, the only god of Egypt. After the suppression of this reform, Ra seems rapidly to have lost his national prestige, and to have sunk to the rank of the local deity of Heliopolis, becoming merged with Ammon as Ammon-Ra. Osiris also owes his early prominence to religious reasons. He was god of the dead, the ruler of the Amenti, and as such was a prominent figure in all epochs of Egyptian history. Together with him, Horus and his mother Isis, and Nebhat, Nephthys, the sister of Osiris, came into prominence. Set, his brother, gained an unenviable notoriety through the Osiris mythology as the evil god, the great enemy of his brother Osiris. Anubis is also drawn into the circle by being made the son of Osiris and Nebhat. Ptah was originally merely the head of the Memphitic pantheon, and as such was no more than the head of any other local pantheon. The rise of Mena, however, the union of the North and South, and the fact that through this union Memphis became the capital of the United Kingdom, gave him a commanding place in the national pantheon. He became the god of the government, and as such the chief god of the nation. And even after Ammon had succeeded him in this position, he held a high place in the religion, until under the Ptolemies he was merged with Osiris into the new god Serapis, who was imported from Asia Minor and given out as a union of Osiris and the Apis bull, the sacred animal of Ptah. At the close of the Old Empire, about 2400 BC, there is a gap in Egyptian history, and it is not until 2100 BC that we again stand on firm ground, and then it is Thebes that is the capital of Egypt, and as a consequence, the head of its local pantheon, Amon, a deity hitherto obscure, is the official head of the national pantheon. He retained this position throughout the 11th and 12th dynasties, but in the 13th dynasty, about 1930 BC, he seems to have surrendered the supremacy to Sebak of Crocodilopolis in the Fayum. Sebak did not retain his position long, for the 13th dynasty ended in anarchy, and soon after its fall the Hyksos invaded Egypt. For several centuries the foreign invaders ruled supreme, but about 1530 BC they were driven out by Aahmes I, a Theban king, and Thebes again became the capital of Egypt. As one consequence of this, Amon again became the official head of the pantheon. But about 1400 BC, he was again dethroned when King Amenhotep IV, Chuenaten, instituted the religious reform above mentioned. Unfortunately, the reform was short-lived, dying soon after its founder. Again, Amon, now called Amon-Ra, ruled supreme. Through all the vicissitudes of Egyptian history, he held his own, even extending his sway to the neighboring kingdom of Napata, founded in Ethiopia early in the 10th century BC, probably by the descendants of the priest kings of Dynasty 21, who had been driven from Egypt by Sheshong I, until finally, when Psemtek I founded the 26th dynasty, he gave way to Neit of Sais. She seems to have retained the place at the head of the national pantheon until the times of the Ptolemies, when Hathor of Dendera and Horus of Edfu shared the supremacy with Serapis. They too finally passed away with the advent of Christianity. Alone of all the old deities, Isis retained her sway, even in Christian times, well into the 4th century A.D. on the island of Philae, but she too finally yielded and passed away before the new religion. Such is as adequate a sketch of the Egyptian religion as can be given in the space allotted. The reader will observe that the religion was not a homogeneous whole, the result of a continuous development along one line of thought, but a heterogeneous mass, the resultant of the union of a large number of religions, each of itself polytheistic in nature, and that with so little fusion of the component parts that we have, all through the history of this curious religion, 3 or 4, and in later times as many as 8, essentially different religions having national recognition, and a large number of local religions running side by side. The reader will further observe that there is no trace of an original monotheism, and that the monotheism which was developed from the Ra religion was a very imperfect one, and was far from being original, the result of many centuries of thought and speculation. End of Chapter 1, Part 2. By F.